All right, what's up, everyone? My name is Michael Rossetti, and I'm here to talk to you about a research project I've been working on with my colleague, Tawhid Zaman, entitled Bots, Disinformation, and the First Trump Impeachment. Impeachment is a mechanism provided by the US Constitution whereby Congress can hold federal government officials accountable for their treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In October and December of 2019, the US House of Representatives charged President Trump with one count of abuse of power and one count of obstruction of Congress. A few months later, the US Senate conducted the trial and acquitted Trump of both charges, or found him innocent. All the while, a battle for public opinion about impeachment was being waged on social media. So we decided to focus our attention on Twitter, one of the leading social media platforms, to see what the discussion was like there. We were especially interested in analyzing the role of bots in the conversation. Bots are automated social media accounts programmed to take certain actions such as tweeting, retweeting, following, and mentioning. Bots can manipulate discussions and amplify certain content artificially. So our research goals in this project were to first collect tweets about the Trump impeachment, second, identify the bots, and third, analyze the bots' behavior and assess their impact on the conversation. We would later discover evidence of disinformation spreading throughout this discussion, so we'll conclude by sharing the results of that disinformation analysis as well. All right, so our first goal is to collect some data from Twitter. We collected tweets about impeachment from December 2019 to March 2020. This includes a period of time before, during, and after the Senate trial. Most of our analysis focuses on a 60-day period from December 20th to February 20th. During this time, we collected tweets mentioning any of the following topics and terms, from generic terms like impeach or impeached, to more specific topics like Trump impeachment. And as the conversation progressed and new trending topics would arise, we would add them to our list as well. For example, terms like acquitted forever. So as a result, we ended up with over 67 million tweets from 3.6 million users. And most of our analysis focuses on 55 million retweets authored by 2.7 million unique users. After we collected millions of tweets from millions of users, we would go back and collect a list of friends and followers for each user. From this data, we constructed a follower network that would later help us assess the reach and influence of each user. The resulting follower network included over 57 million directed edges or connections between users. All right, so we've collected millions of tweets from millions of users, and now our goal is to detect the bots. Thankfully, my colleague Tawhid had worked on a previous bot detection research project in which he and his colleagues used an algorithm called the Ising model from statistical physics to identify the bots. This method is able to identify all the bots at once based on their anomalous retweet behavior. In other words, it leverages the observation that bots retweet humans at unusually high frequencies. In order to apply the Ising model to our data set, we first needed to assemble a retweet graph. In a retweet graph, each node represents a user who is doing the retweeting or being retweeted, and each directed edge represents one or more retweets from one user to another. The Ising model, when applied to a retweet graph, produces a bot probability score for each user based on their retweet behavior. Due to memory constraints involved with constructing a single retweet graph for the entire conversation, we instead constructed retweet graphs on a daily basis. Here you can see an example distribution of the resulting bot probability scores for one of these days. For any user, with at least one daily bot probability score greater than 80%, we would classify them as a bot moving forward. This resulted in around a total of 24,000 bots, which is less than 1% of all users in our data set. So just a small fraction or a small sliver of our users are bots. Now that we've identified the bots, we'll start to analyze some of their activity. We find that although bots only represent less than 1% of users in our data set, they are responsible for over 31% of all tweets. So a small fraction of users are responsible for around a third of the total content in this discussion. So bots are very active in this discussion. They tweet around 100 times more frequently than humans do. So who are they retweeting? What are they saying? What are their sentiments? We'll first have to train a model to discern impeachment sentiments, and then we'll come back and apply the resulting opinion analysis to the bots to see if we could learn more about their behavior. So we set off to train an impeachment opinion classifier model. The goal is to predict the degree to which any given tweet expresses either pro-Trump or anti-Trump sentiments. Anti-Trump sentiments are represented by a 0. Pro-Trump sentiments are represented by a 1, and something neutral or in the middle could be represented by a 0.5. So in order to discern sentiments, pro-Trump or anti-Trump, we first have to assemble a list of pro-Trump hashtags and a list of anti-Trump hashtags. Instead of choosing the hashtags ourselves, we derive them from the data. We used an unsupervised clustering technique to separate bots into different groups based on similarities in their retweet behavior. This resulted in 2 different bot clusters, one that retweeted left-leaning targets and one that retweeted right-leaning targets. We would then analyze the language used by each of these bot clusters and identify the top hashtags used by each. On the left, we see bots using hashtags in terms like impeach and remove, vote blue no matter who, and Biden 2020. These are clearly left-leaning sentiments being expressed. On the right, we see some pro-Trump sentiments being expressed through Trump campaign slogans: build the wall, drain the swamp, make America great again, keep America great. We see sentiments related to gun ownership, like the Second Amendment and the NRA. And we also see some QAnon related hashtags that the pro-Trump bots are spreading throughout the network. So this begs the question, what is QAnon and what are these pro-Trump bots talking about? It turns out that QAnon is a big conspiracy theory and disinformation campaign. We weren't looking to conduct disinformation analysis, but based on our interest in what the bots were doing, we now have evidence of some disinformation spreading, and we'll come back and revisit more about this disinformation later. But right now we're in the middle of training an impeachment opinion classifier model, so let's get back to that. At this point, we have a list of pro-Trump hashtags and anti-Trump hashtags, and we're ready to use those hashtags to label tweets in our data set for model training. So for any user who expressed those hashtags in their profile, we labeled those users with either a 0 or a 1 based on which sentiments they were expressing. Then for each of those labeled users, we would label all of their tweets with the same sentiment label. This resulted in a data set of around 2.8 million unique labeled tweet texts to use for model training. The labeled data set was generally balanced with around 1.3 million texts on either side. So now that we have labeled some data, we're ready to train a classifier model. We chose a state-of-the-art BERT transformer model, and we used 80% of the labeled data for training and the remaining 20% for testing. The model scored over 96% accuracy on the test data. So at this time, we have a trained model, and we could use it to score any given tweet in the data set. Here are some example scores. You can see how certain language like sham may have an impact in contributing to the score based on how the model was trained. We used the trained model to assign an opinion score to every tweet in our data set. And then we assigned an opinion score to each user equal to the average opinion score for all their tweets. If you're interested, you can explore more results of this opinion analysis on our website. But at this time, we've trained an opinion classifier model and we're ready to apply the results back to our bot analysis. So, of the 24,000 bots we originally identified, based on the sentiments they were expressing in their tweets, we find there were around 14,000 pro-Trump bots and 10,000 anti-Trump bots. So there are around 40% more pro-Trump bots than anti-Trump bots. When we look at how many bots were active each day, we see there are more pro-Trump bots active each day than anti-Trump bots. And we find that pro-Trump bots tweet slightly more frequently than anti-Trump bots. So these bots are tweeting a lot, but is anyone listening to what they're saying? We measured the number of users in our data set who follow the bots. And we find that over 800,000 users in our data set follow at least one bot. So around 1/3 of our users follow a bot. We see pro-Trump bots have more total followers in our data set than anti-Trump bots do. So these bots may have a certain degree of follower reach about them, but can we quantify their persuasive impact in more detail? We would use a network centrality algorithm called the Generalized Harmonic Influence Centrality, or GHIC for short, to try to assess the shift in mean opinion when bots are removed from the network. When we look at the GHIC results for each bot community on a daily basis, we find that pro-Trump bots have a greater level of influence or impact on most days. And there are only a handful of days when anti-Trump bots have more influence. This generally reflects the bot's efforts to amplify certain content on certain days. And when we examine the content from any given day, we start to form a better understanding of whose content is being amplified. So in addition to calculating GHIC scores for each bot community, we also calculated GHIC scores for each user in our data set to find who the top influencers are and to quantify their influence. We find that Trump has by far the greatest influence out of all of the users in our data set. This isn't surprising because when we look at who the bots are retweeting, we find the bots are retweeting Trump the most by far. In our data set, Trump was retweeted by bots around 800,000 times, whereas the next most retweeted user on either side of the discussion was only retweeted around less than half of that amount. So we know whose content the bots are promoting, but let's take another look at what content they're promoting. When we look at the top hashtags used in all bot profiles, on the left, we see hashtags like resist and vote blue no matter who, like we saw before. And on the right, we see more Trump campaign slogans and more evidence of disinformation. Hashtags like WWG1, WGA, or where we go one, we go all, a sort of call to arms for Q-Anon supporters. So we see pro-Trump bots spreading disinformation through their user profiles as well as their tweets. These are the top hashtags used in bot tweets. So this prompted us to perform some more disinformation analysis. So in order to do this, we first labeled all the users in our data set who expressed any Q-Anon sentiments or hashtags in their profiles. This resulted in around 24,000 Q-Anon users. Around 1/10 of these were bots. So we had around 2,500 Q-Anon bots. And this allowed us to compare the activity of Q-Anon users against other user groups. When we apply the GHIC algorithm to different groups to measure their persuasive impact, we actually find that the QAnon bots have less impact than their non-QAnon counterparts on both sides of the discussion. So maybe QAnon bots are preaching to the converted and less influential to outsiders, but may still be dangerous in other ways, perhaps in terms of their language or content. So let's take a look at what language these bots are using. We conducted a toxic language analysis for all the tweets in our data set. We used a pre-trained toxicity classification model to assign toxicity scores to each tweet in our data set. And you can see some examples here. Then we assigned each user a toxicity score equal to the average toxicity scores of all their tweets. This allowed us to compare the average toxicity scores for each group of users. And the results are somewhat surprising for me personally. When we compare the toxicity scores of various groups, we find that humans are more toxic than bots are, and anti-Trump users are more toxic than pro-Trump users. Also, normal non-QAnon users are more toxic than QAnon users. So this is possibly because left-leaning humans are expressing their outrage on Twitter about Trump being acquitted. So bots aren't necessarily spreading more dangerous language, but what about spreading false information? Could we quantify the degree to which they're spreading disinformation throughout the network? Our final analysis that I'll talk to you about is a news quality analysis, whereby we obtained a third-party list of news quality classifications and fact-check scores for each media outlet, including major media outlets like the ones you see here, as well as more hyper-partisan and fake news outlets that you don't see here. So for any tweet in our data set, if it included a link to one of these outlets, we would apply the corresponding fact-check score to that tweet. Then we calculated fact-check scores for each user equal to the average fact-check scores for all their tweets. This allows us to compare the average fact-check scores for different groups of users. So we found that the baseline fact-check score for all users in our data set was around 3.5 out of 5, where 5 is mainstream media or high quality news, and 1 is fake news. So the baseline is around 3.5. When we compare humans against bots, we find that bots are spreading more disinformation or fake news than humans are. And we find that pro-Trump users are spreading significantly more fake news than anti-Trump users. Finally, we find that QAnon users are spreading significantly more fake news than their normal counterparts. So at this time, we've quantified the degree to which disinformation is being spread across the network in the discussion about the first Trump impeachment. Due to time constraints, that's all I have to talk about for now. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to check out our website or get in contact. I'd love to hear from you. That's it. Peace out. Have a nice day.